Hello, my name's Dave Thompson, and I am the author of An Evolving Tradition, The Child Ballads in Modern Folk and Rock, which is a book telling the story of, indeed, the Child Ballads, but not as so many of its predecessors have done from a point of view of who wrote them, when were they written, what were they about. This is more about what has been done with the songs since they were compiled together in a series of volumes by Francis J. Child, who was a Harvard professor working at the end of the 19th century, gathering together what he hoped would be the definitive collection of the best English and Scottish folk songs, traditional songs, that had survived to that point. Of course, in writing them down and publishing them, he ensured that they would survive for a lot longer than that. The book itself is generally regarded and is described by several of the people I talk to as the gold standard of traditional song, in that I think everybody knows at least one child ballad, whether they know it or not. Thinking of Scarborough Fair, which was a huge hit for Simon and Garfunkel, Gallows Pole, which Led Zeppelin covered, so many others, Barbara Allen, which it seems everybody has sung at some point. And the book is really about the development of the ballads since Child wrote or compiled them. So we begin with a gentleman named Henry Burr, who was a Canadian singer, born in the late 19th century. His dad ran a sweet shop, which must have been a great way to grow up. But he moved to New York. He became an opera singer, but he also had a career recording popular music, as it was at that time. And in 1908, he became the first person ever to record a child ballad for commercial purposes. He recorded Jock o' Hazeldean, which is not necessarily one of the great standards within the volumes, but it was very popular amongst a coterie of performers who loved old Scottish songs. That was huge in the 1900s. So he recorded Jock o' Hazeldean and recorded it several other times as well. Here's a version that he did a couple of years later under the name of John Young.
I'll wed ye to my youngest son, and ye shall be bride, and ye shall be his bride, lady. Stay comely to be seen, but I shall lose the tears soon far, for Jock o' Hazeldean. And dry that cheek so pale. Young Frank is cheap of herring.
He was not, however, the first person to actually record a child ballad. That was, depending upon which side of the recording machine you're sitting, a Mr. Thompson, no relation sadly, who sang a version of Lord Bateman to Percy Grainger, who was an Australian pianist and composer touring Eastern England in search of folk songs, and quite revolutionarily at that time, because British song collectors did not like recording machines. He took with him a recorder, and he would sit these very old, generally, people down and ply them with food and drink, and have them sing their songs. So Mr. Thompson on the 7th of May 1906 is actually the very first person we can hear sing a child ballad. And on his further visits to the area, Granger recorded a number of people singing a number of folk songs, but his favourite was Joseph Taylor, who was 82 years old at the time, had won a lot of prizes locally for his singing, and Granger discovered him at a song competition, a local song competition, completely fell in love with Taylor's voice, recorded him on several occasions, but most notably in 1908, he brought Taylor down to London, where they recorded a number of songs, including Lord Bateman, for an LP, a collection of 78s that were bound together as an album titled, get this, Percy Granger's Collection of English Folk Songs Sung by Genuine Peasant Performers, which says a lot for the prevalent attitude at the time, or prevalent belief, that folk music was the voice of the people, as the later Topic Records collection puts it, that it was sung by farmers, agricultural workers, fishermen, people who worked with the land and entertained themselves as they worked by singing old folk songs, some of which were amongst those that Child collected. This is one of those areas my book, An Evolving Tradition, doesn't really get into. There's a lot of books out there that will talk about the origins of traditional song, how it should be formed, who it was performed by. I look back at the history of song purely through the collections that appeared before Child by people like Bishop Percy, Samuel Pepys, the Harris Sisters, Anna Gordon, people whose work was referred to by Child, and Walter Scott was another one, Robert Burns. Child referred to all these earlier books, or garlands as they were called, as he was compiling the Child Ballads. So he really did his homework. He really dug deep. He searched out the original, or what he felt were the original versions, as opposed to those that Scott was particularly guilty of this. He'd have an old ballad and he'd read it and say, well, that doesn't look right, I don't like that bit, and he would change them, and then publish them in his book, The Minstrelsy. Child went back and said, no, I'm not going to take any modern or recent editorial fixes. I want the original texts. And it's funny because the Lord Bateman that Mr. Thompson and Joseph Taylor sang, it was actually the same one that had been published in late 1830s by Charles Dickens, William Thackeray, and George Cruikshank, the artist. It was called The Loving Ballad of Lord Bateman, and they put it out as a slim volume, beautifully illustrated by Cruikshank. And they claimed they had taken their version from the tripe skewer, who was a young man of maybe 19, who one of the three is said to have encountered on the streets of London singing a song. Child actually used their version in the Child Ballads, saying it was an example of how a song had been adapted into Cockney by genuine street singers. But the suspicion also lays that either Dickens or Thackeray, most people think Thackeray, also went in and fiddled around a bit. And that's the version that Percy Grainger was so besotted with when he heard it sung by Joseph Taylor. And if we fast forward 66 years, we come to what started me on my book, the Albion band, which was Ashley Hutchings, Steve Ashley, and so on. They recorded their own version of Lord Bateman, and they took elements of it from Joseph Taylor's version, which had just been reissued, just been released on an album called Unto Brig Fair, which collected together a lot of Grainger's recordings. They heard that, and it inspired them to their own folk rock version. And I heard that story and I just thought, isn't it fascinating how a song can make that leap across so many decades, but still sound fresh and modern, and I mean everything you'd want from early 1970s folk rock. And I wondered how did other songs fare?
Lord Bateman was a noble lord, a noble lord of some high degree. He shipped himself on board of a ship, some foreign country he would go see.
In the prison there grew a tree. It grew so large and it grew so strong, and where he was chained all around the middle, and there his life it was almost born. His jailer had but one only daughter, and the fairest creature that my eyes did see, and she stole the key from her father's pillow, and swallowed Bateman she would set free.
Given the sheer antiquity of the ballads, it's ironic that the earliest tune we have for any of them are those composed by Joseph Haydn, the Austrian classical music composer, I suppose you'd call him. He was commissioned on 3 separate occasions in the late 1700s, early 1800s, to compose fresh airs for a variety of Scottish traditional songs, which would then be published in these beautiful bound volumes at what were then very extravagant prices, for sale to well-heeled gentlemen and gentlewomen to perform in their parlours on sing-along evenings. They have nothing whatsoever to do with folk music, but in terms of musical survival, that's where I begin the book with Haydn. And then, of course, we have a fairly vast gap, a century, a little over a century, before people started recording songs. There were a few music hall survivors that we know from sheet music, but generally it was with the 1900s. And once the gramophone had taken off and singers were out there recording as well as just singing, then we start to see a huge number of traditional songs and a reasonable number of child ballads making their way onto shellac. Towards the end of an evolving tradition, there is a series of 8 playlists, which are my attempt, successful or otherwise, I'll leave it up to you, to point readers towards especially noteworthy exemplary versions of all 305 ballads, or at least all of those that have been recorded, because not all of them have been. But variety of playlists. One is for classical and spoken word. There's unaccompanied performances, which of course is many people's preferred method of delivering the ballads. There's acoustic, there's electric, there's 21st century recordings, of which there were many more than I was expecting to find, which is proof that these things live on. There's a playlist for field recordings, which are those genuine peasant performers of which Percy Grainger and HMV were so fond. But we begin with The Child on 78, which for me was the most eye-opening, I think, because I was finding them everywhere. There's a terrific blues version of Cabbage Head Blues, which is Child 274, by Lena Kimbrough. Sorry, she had so many names. Lena Kimbrough. There's Lizzie Lindsay, which was recorded by Margaret Woodrow Wilson, the daughter of President Woodrow Wilson, and for a time, following her mother's death, his first lady. She is the first female singer to record a child ballad, and the first lady, and probably the only first lady ever to record it. Some of the material may be familiar to you from the Harry Smith Anthology of American Folk Music, which came out in 1952, but for a very long time, probably to this day actually, is regarded among the most important collections of traditional American music. Side 1 was comprised of child ballads, and I know there are a lot of people who I talk to whose first introduction was from Mr. Smith. There's also material from those now legendary sessions that various record labels held in the South in the late 20s, very, very early 30s, from which people like the Carter family were brought to fame. Bill and Belle Reed, I find the most entertaining. They turned up with 3 children, and were effectively 3 different groups. There was Bill and Belle themselves, husband and wife, who performed a child ballad. There were the Reed children, which was just the kids. And then there was the Reed family, which was all 5 of them. It was a proto-Osmonds situation. Unfortunately, the one session was their only session, but their version of The Old Lady and the Devil it's terrific. It's just so much fun listening to it, and I think I will play a little bit of it now.
There was an old man lived foot of the hill. If he ain't moved away, he's a living there still, singing fi diddle-I, diddle-I, fi diddle-I, diddle-I day. He hitched up his hogs and went out to plow. How he got around, we never knew how, singing fi diddle-I, diddle-I, fi diddle-I, diddle-I day. Old devil come to him in the field one day, saying, one of your family I'm going to take away, saying, fi diddle-I, diddle-I, fi diddle-I, diddle-I day. Take her on with the joy of my heart. I hope by golly you'll never part, singing fi diddle-I, diddle-I, fi diddle-I, diddle-I day.
That was Bill and Belle Reed. Next, I think I'm going to play Cabbage Head Blues, because again, you think of traditional music, you think of folk music, you don't really think of this.
Lord, somebody can bite me in my butt just as sure as you born. I want to ask you one question. Sweet mama, don't you lie to me. I want to ask you one question. Sweet mama, don't you lie to me. Now whose head is on that pillow? Well, mine ought to be. Lord, Lord, Daddy, you blind and shorty cannot see. Who you calling blind? Lord, Lord, Daddy, you blind and cannot see. It ain't nothing blind about the preaching kid. That was nothing but a cabbage head your mama gave to me. Why, you are the linest woman I ever seen.
Now I travel this country for 25 years, Lord. Feel like I'm good for about 40 years more. Lord, I've traveled this country 25 long years or more. But I never seen a head of cabbage with mustache on before.
The quality of that is an indication of how rare the original 78 is. But to make amends, here is Sonny Boy Williamson doing the same song about 30 years later.
I come home one night, I was tired, yes I could be. I saw a mule in my stable, what my mule's supposed to be. Wake up, baby, and explain all this stuff to me. Who was mule that in my stable? What my mule supposed to be? This must be silly, you talk right funny. Why don't you open up your eyes and see? You know that ain't nothing but milk out that my mother sent to me. I've been all over the world, to Cabo, Mexico. I never saw no milk out with a saddle on his back before.
And as I went home on Tuesday night, as drunk could be, I saw a coat behind the door where my old coat should be. Well, I called me wife and I said to her, will you kindly tell to me who owns that coat behind the door where my old coat should be? Ah, you're drunk, you silly old fool, still you cannot see that's a woolen blanket that me mother sent to me. Well, it's many a day I've travelled 100 miles or more, but buttons in a blanket shawl I never saw before.
And we finished there with the Dubliners' Seven Drunken Nights, yet another version of the same song. This one holds the honour of being the first child ballad ever to make the UK top 10, and I believe it is still the only one. It also topped the charts in Ireland in 1967, despite being banned because of its somewhat ripe subject matter. We've jumped ahead of ourselves quite a bit here, going back to the 30s and 40s, the Carter family. This was the period where country music and folk music were beginning to take a hold, were beginning to formulate themselves into something that we would recognise today. And two singers in particular, Burl Ives and John Jacob Niles, did a lot to popularise the child ballads during this period. I'm going to play a little bit of John Jacob Niles simply because his approach can still alienate listeners today. It was a very peculiar voice, very much an acquired taste. He described it as the electrifying effect of the male C sharp alto, sorry. However, there was another review that I read, written more recently, as you will guess, which said, imagine the Violent Femmes country death song being performed by a neutered Nick Cave, then compare the result to the sounds of a feral turkey being slowly boiled. Which you just have to listen to, don't you?
Slack your line, slack it just a while, for I think I see my papa coming, traveling many a mile, traveling many a mile. Papa, papa, has you brought gold for to pay this hangman's fee? Or did you come to see me swinging high from this hangman's tree, high from this hangman's tree?
The marriage of folk music and rock music was well consummated. folk which had come through the 50s and 60s largely as a political force as much as a musical force, in that it was so bound up with the American Civil Rights Movement and the various English campaigns, the Aldermaston marches and so forth. Rock was not necessarily welcomed in by the folk community, but the rock community certainly seemed impressed, or pop as it was in those days. The Animals' House of the Rising Sun is often looked at as the starting point, in that they took a traditional song, not the first to do so, of course, and electrified it all the way to number one. Then there was Dylan and his conversion. And then there was Shirley Collins and Davy Graham's Folk Roots, New Roots album, with a lovely version of the Cherry Tree Carol. But this was closer to a marriage between jazz and folk, but is often viewed as one of those year one moments after which things changed significantly. You had the Byrds coming along. Their influences were very firmly in the folk element. Jefferson Airplane even, but without Fairport Convention, folk rock as we know it today, and many folk songs, child ballads among them as we know them today, would be very different. The irony about Fairport's subsequent status is that Sandy Denny, who was the guiding force behind the decision to investigate English folk music in the first place, did not want to continue. She saw it as a one-off project, after which the group would get back to recording their own material. Her bandmates disagreed. They wanted to investigate further. So Sandy left. To heap irony onto irony, Ashley Hutchings also left because the band didn't want to go far enough. He wanted to dive head on into traditional music, Morris dance, all manner of other areas. So we ended up with 3 very enjoyable and successful acts. Sandy formed Fotheringay and then went solo. Ashley formed Steeleye Span and then the Albion band, and Fairport continued. However, to dwell on the Fairport Convention, Steeleye Span, etc. axis is to overlook the English folk club scene, which grew up alongside and around and in and out of all these other convolutions. Names like Frankie Armstrong, Ann Briggs, Steve Tilston, Dave Cousins and the Strawberry Hill Boys, who went on to become the Strawbs, Al Stewart, Martin Carthy, they all graduated from the folk clubs, and most, if not all, had child ballads in their repertoire and subsequently recorded some. It's astonishing to think that there were these artists who were holding entire audiences just in raptures, performing songs that were so old and performing them not in what a folk audience necessarily thought was the correct manner. Again, instrumentation, electric instrumentation, there were no boundaries, and the child ballads are not unique in that they were so easily adapted, but the stories told in the ballads worked for audiences. There are so many supernatural epics, so many murder ballads, so many songs of heartache and death and all the things that you associate with folk music, but they're so much more visceral in the child ballads. And that was Professor Child's greatest achievement, many people think, that he did not only go for good ballads, he went for exciting, enthralling ballads, battles. Robin Hood takes up pretty much an entire volume. There are reams of Robin Hood ballads, most of which nobody knows. I mean, yes, they do. They sing them. But the general public is like, never heard that one, never heard that one, never heard that one. But you know the stories. The stories have lived on. And a lot of the stories, we watch on television or in the movies, they're based on ballads that Child put in his book. Now, the other big influence on the British scene and by osmosis the international scene was the BBC, who, I was not really aware of this, but almost as soon as the BBC launched in 1922, they were championing folk music. Admittedly, it was fairly straightforward, but every so often they would go off-piste and allow new composers to have a go at creating new settings for songs, or they would send the outside broadcast unit out to a pub in the middle of nowhere to record the locals singing. And these were incredibly popular shows. We know that because they kept doing it. And by the 1950s, the BBC had a dedicated folk unit headed by a gentleman named Peter Kennedy, who worked with Alan Lomax, who also plays a big part in the book. First time I've mentioned him. Hours and hours and hours of field recordings from the BBC. They're out there. Some have been released, a lot haven't. But they're a fascinating listen, because you hear the songs in their natural environment. But we're lucky today because we can also think of the versions of the songs that we've heard since those were recorded. I've done that a few times, playing early 78s and then later rock versions, but now I'm going to switch from field recordings to rock versions, and see what you make of this.
Saddle me a milk-white steed, bridle me a pony, and I'll ride down to London town, and I'll beg for the life of my Geordie. And when she came to the courthouse steps, the poor folks numbered many. 100 crowns she passed around, saying, "Pray for the life of my Geordie." He never stole a mule or a mare, he never murdered any. If he shot one of the king's wild deer, it was only to feed his family.
That was Georgie, which is Child 209, which was performed first by Nancy Weaver Stykeleather for the collector Robert Winslow Gordon, and it was followed by Mitchell and Hamer with the same Geordie from their 2013 album, The Child Ballads. Next we have Beau Lambkin, performed by Bobby McMillan. It's from a album called simply Lambkin's Variations Across the Northern Hemisphere, which came out a few years ago. And from there we will go into Steeleye Span's version, and I think you'll enjoy them both.
Was as fine a mason as ever laid a stone. He built a fine castle, and pay he got none. He built a fine castle, and pay he got none. He built a fine castle, both outside and in, but he left a little window for to let himself in.
There's the monster of the house, says Long Langton, leads away to London, says the nurse to him. There's the lady of the house, says Long
in a cradle, says the nurse to him. We will pinch him, we will prick him, we will stab him with a pin, and the nurse shall hold the basin for the blood all to run in. So they pinched him, then they pricked him, then they stabbed him with a pin, and the pulseless held the basin for the blood all to run in.
The 70s were the peak of folk rock in the UK and elsewhere. The 80s really, they weren't the wasteland that a lot of people like to say they were. The chapter I have on the 80s includes some remarkable talents and some great child ballads as well. But really it was the 90s into the 2000s that things really began to stir in the undergrowth as the first roots of what we now call the folk horror, weird folk movement began to stir through the work of people like Current 93, Stone Breath, Kitchen Cynics. There was a lot of action going around on what most people would regard as the underside of the underground, and it just incrementally began creeping out, which is not to say that it's now huge, but most people, if you say folk horror, they have an idea of what you mean. It's this very broad church which includes 70s television, public service announcements and adverts and films. I mean, anything and everything from the 70s just has that edge of disquiet and something nasty under the bedclothes. And the music that has developed over the last quarter century to accompany this flowering has been spectacular. Arguably, we are in as productive a period today as we ever were in the 60s and 70s when it comes to taking traditional songs in general and the child ballads in particular and really doing new things with them. And it isn't just modern acts doing it. If you reach the end of the book and make your way through the playlists, you will find a QR code that will take you to a free download of the new album by the London Experimental Ensemble, which, as its name suggests, is an experimental ensemble based in London. They have already tackled the child ballads once a couple of years ago in an album called the Child Ballads, and to say that you need to listen to it rather than have me try to describe it is futile. It's amazing, but it is so disconcerting even if you are expecting disconcerting music. Talking to Ed Peterson, who is one of the group afterwards, and telling him about the book, and we were just discussing what would be a great way that the band could follow up this first album, and the idea arose of the final 6 child ballads, numbers 300 to 305, which nobody has ever recorded. And I said earlier that there's a number that haven't been recorded, but this is a sequence of 6 ballads which personally I consider as reading material among the best ones. And Ed went off and he listened to them, and he came back to me a while later and said, we're doing them. And I was expecting something great. They exceeded my expectations, not only with the performances, the arrangements, the fact that they were able to cram all those words in, because these are not short ballads, but also the people who actually became involved in the project. John Wesley Harding, who I'd already talked about in the book for an album he did celebrating the music of Nick Jones back in the late 90s. He's there. Marisa Nadler, who was already one of my favourite singers. Richard Thompson is there. And Richard Thompson, I mean, ex-Fairport, ex-Albion band, you know, it's like folk runs through his veins, it is said. And while he has been fairly stingy in doling out the child ballads, Henry V's Conquest of France, I think, is the only one he's actually overtly recorded in his own right. Here he is, and he's doing one of the final 6 ballads that I never thought I would ever hear somebody record for commercial purposes, because it's an album, it's a CD, and it's a download with an evolving tradition. So I'm very happy about that, very proud to be part of such a great album, and very proud of this book. It's something I've been talking about doing for at least 10 years, and something I've been thinking about for longer, and I finally did it. And it's Backbeat, the publishers, did a beautiful job. It's a hardback. A friend has already told me, did you know your book is too heavy to read in bed? Over 500 pages. That does include end notes, playlists and indexes, but it's still over 400 pages of text. And I've only talked about a fraction of what's in there at the moment. I've missed out some great chapters in the middle where we're talking about the early collectors and mid-period collectors. Few household names, but you'll read their adventures. You will hopefully go online, track down whatever music that they recorded is available, and you'll be as excited as I am. And then some great singers. One of my favourite stories before I go. There was a collector in Colorado in the 60s and 70s named Ben Lumpkin, and he was been collecting child ballads or folk ballads for about 20 years, and right towards the end of the project, 1969, he met this woman named Edith Cummings Taylor in Boulder. She was a widow, and she had some songs that he had never recorded before, or never heard, never had anybody sing to him before. One of them was Robin Hood and Little John, one of those rare Robin Hood songs, many Robin Hood songs, and The Mermaid, and nice versions. But it was as they were talking, and she mentioned an ancestor relative who had been a sea captain and one who was an abolitionist, and Lumpkin said, "So what did you used to do?" She said, "Oh, I was an astronomer." And he said, "Oh, that's nice." Very dismissive. Let's talk about your abolitionist sea captain relatives. And I thought, a woman astronomer in the 1920s, that's rare. So I did a lot of research, and she was poised to become a major figure in astronomy, as was so often the case. What she thought was her life's work was given up when she married, but her work remained in print for a long time. Her thesis was a standard reference in one area. Absolutely amazing woman, and she today her work is forgotten, but it's her music, or not forgotten, but her work is overlooked in modern astronomy because, of course, it's 100 years old now. But her music is still out there. Go to the NSA website, there she is, Mermaid and Robin Hood, and it's like that. That is one of the things I've loved about this book, and one of the things I love about the Child Ballads is that you can just slip from the oldest person singing the oldest song on the oldest tape to a modern version, and still get the same feeling from it as you did from from the first one. There's not much music you can say that about. I mean, how many times can you name your rock and roll favourite before you know all the words backwards and start to nod off a little? The Child Ballads, they've been keeping people awake for 100 years on record, 130 years in the ballad book itself, and close to a millennium en masse. And, well, that's it really. The book's out now, or it will be this weekend, the book's, and it's, I hope you like it. I'm thrilled with it. Thanks for listening and watching. Bye.
Lay down below, while the landlubbers lay down below. Then up spoke the captain of our gallant ship, and a right good captain was he. I've a wife and a child in Boston town, and tonight a widow she'll be, and tonight a widow she'll be. Oh, the raging sea did roar, and the stormy winds did blow, and we poor sailors went skipping through the tops, while the landlubbers lay down below, while the landlubbers lay down below. Then up spoke the mate of our gallant ship, and a fine big man was he. I've a new wed bride in New Bedford town, and I fear she a widow will be, and I fear a widow she'll be. Oh, the raging sea did roar, and the stormy winds did blow, and we poor sailors went skipping through the tops, while the landlubbers lay down below, while the landlubbers lay down below. Then up spoke the cook of our gallant ship, and a crusty old salt was he. I've a dear old wife in Plymouth town, and I fear she a widow will be, and I fear a widow she'll be. Oh, the raging sea did roar, and the stormy winds did blow, and we poor sailors went skipping through the tops, while the landlubbers lay down below, while the landlubbers lay down below. And up then spoke the little cabin boy, and a pretty little boy was he. My mother and my father in old Provincetown will weep more than your widows three, will weep more than your widows three. Oh, the raging sea did roar, and the stormy winds did blow, and we poor sailors went skipping through the tops, while the landlubbers lay down below, while the landlubbers lay down below. Then 3 times round turned our gallant ship, and 3 times round turned she. For want of a lifeboat we all were drowned, and our ship sank down in the sea, and our ship sank down in the sea. Oh, the raging sea did roar, and the stormy winds did blow, and we poor sailors went skipping through the tops, while the landlubbers lay down below, while the landlubbers lay down below. There's a note here. It's almost as if there was a stanza missing. Why, after they saw the mermaid, did their bad luck start? It's because a mermaid was an ill omen, And it was bad luck to sail on Friday.